Hey guys, hope everybody out there is doing good. Thanks for tuning back into the video. I really appreciate it. And today I'm going to share with you guys what I consider the number one fishing lesson that my dad taught me and left me with, and how I sort of use that overall lesson to be able to have a career in professional fishing. I don't think he intended that at the time, but it turned out like that, and I'm going to share that story with you guys. Real quick before you just get started, just wanted to remind you guys once again, if you guys are interested in any of our Fish the Moment lake map breakdowns, go to fishthemoment.com. You can check them out there. Johnny and I have a full catalog of breakdowns of lakes across the country, offshore areas, shallow water areas, personal lake map breakdowns, along with a lot of other really good stuff at fishthemoment.com, so you can check that out. Okay, let's talk a little bit about my dad here. As you guys know, my dad passed away a couple of weeks ago. He was almost 86, 85. He just turned 86. Actually, it would have been his birthday last week. So I did a video earlier talking about that, and I wanted to share, some of the stuff, or one of the main things, a lot of things, but one of the main things that he taught me that he didn't really know he was teaching me, because my dad wasn't, he bass fished back in the 60s and early 70s a little bit, not a whole lot. Did more bass fishing back like in the early 60s, when I was a little bitty kid. But as he got older, he sort of got out of it and did more crappie fishing. And we never really had a real bass boat growing up. My dad had a 16-foot V-bottom Starcraft with an 18 horse on it and a trolling motor on the back end of it. So we'd go in that a little bit, but back then, it was just a different world, so it really wasn't what it is now. But anyway, the lesson that Dad taught me, that he wasn't really teaching me, but he taught me as I observed him, was through his crappie fishing, because my dad really liked to crappie fish, and we had a friend that had a house around the Sailboat Bridge area at Grand Lake, which was about 35 miles from our house in Joplin. So we'd go down there to our friend's house, on the weekends, and he had a dock there. They had, like it was like a little mom and pop resort, and there was a heated crappie dock and an outside crappie dock. And Dad would go down there and crappie fish, and I got to watch him crappie fish, and for some reason he always caught more crappie than anyone else. It's like normally back then, this was in the 70s, crappie fishing was a real social event. You'd have 4 or 5 guys out on the dock drinking beer. In the wintertime, they'd be in the heated dock fishing for crappie. They'd sitting in chairs, that type of stuff. So, you were on one dock. So two of the things that I learned from watching my dad fish is that I learned through crappie fishing later on about flipping and pitching, is that I started watching my dad, because he'd always be catching more crappie than anyone else. And I started watching him. He would put action on his crappie jig that other people weren't putting on it. It's like he'd hold the line in his hand and like twitch the line like that a little bit, just give that crappie jig a little bit of action like that, and he'd always catch more fish. And on top of that, most of these docks, these crappie docks, they had brush hanging off of them. And, he'd drop them vertical alongside the dock. He'd work that crappie jig a little bit. If he didn't get a bite, in a couple minutes, he'd reel it in, and he'd just place it maybe 6 inches away from where it was before and do the same thing again, and super, super methodically work that crappie jig around that brush pile. So, and I watched him do this for years, and I watched him, they caught bass also on the crappie jigs, but lots of crappie. So anyway, as I got into my late teens and early 20s, and I started learning about flipping and pitching, I started remembering about how many more bass Dad would catch than anybody else, twitching his finger like that and just barely moving the bait 6 inches at a time. And I started doing that with my pitching and flipping. It's like if first of all, I learned to pitch and flip around flooded willow trees and bushes at Grand Lake. That's where my flipping started. And I started adopting some of the stuff that Dad was doing with crappie fishing, because I figured, crappie and bass, they're both predators. They both eat the same. So when I was working my bushes, flipping my jig in my bushes, I'd pitch it in there and I'd sort of work it the same way. I'd sort of just twitch it like Dad did in the same spot, you know, without moving it like that. If I didn't get a bite, I'd reel it in and I'd pitch it like 6 or 8 inches away on the next limb, just, you know, working in one spot, fishing super slow, super methodically in these bushes and laydowns or whatever I came to. And as it turned out, it was very successful for me. Back in the early and mid 80s when I started doing that, I won a lot of tournaments in Missouri and Oklahoma, a lot of the, you know, the Redmans, you know, buddy tournaments, that type of stuff. Used it on the pro circuits. A couple of my Bassmaster wins came flipping and pitching like that. Probably 75% of the top 10s. I've gotten, you know, close to 40 top 10s and Bassmaster or top 100s, FLWs. Most all those, at least 75% of them came pitching and flipping. Going back to the same way Dad taught me with the crappie jig, just barely moving that thing, twitching it in one spot, you know, not getting in a big hurry. So it was really a big rule in patience at the time. I mean, because if you're not patient, you can't really do that. And in order to be a good crappie fisherman, you have to be patient. I got to watching a lot of these old timers down there when I was a little kid. You know, Dad, he'd be down there fishing with these dudes that were like 85 years old at the time. This was back in the 70s, you know, guys that were probably World War I veterans. And these old dudes would be the same way, man. They just barely moved that crappie jig and they'd catch a bunch. And I couldn't catch anything because I'd drop it down there, shake it a few times, reel it in real fast, move 5 feet down the dock. I didn't have any patience, but I learned a lot of patience watching Dad and watching those old dudes that paid off in my career in bass fishing. So anyway, hope you guys learned something out of that. You might be able to take that and use it like I did. I think it'll help out if you follow some of that advice. He also told me you can't catch a bass. Dad would always tell me, you know, anytime I came home after a bad tournament, he goes, well, damn it, Randy, you can't catch a bass running 60 miles down the lake, 60 miles an hour down the lake. So it's another piece of advice I'll pass on to you. So anyway, guys, thanks for tuning in. Much appreciated. Please hit that subscribe button if you haven't. It would be much appreciated, and we'll talk later. See you.